Namaste everyone. In this lecture we will discuss on topic homeostasis. What is homeostasis? Homeostasis is defined as maintenance of nearly constant conditions in the internal environment. Let's discuss what does it mean. See, our human body is made up of smallest structural functional units called cells. There are around 100 trillion cells in our body. And each cell for its survival, the cell for its survival needs, what are the cell requirements? Oxygen, nutrients, electrolytes, water for metabolism. So for the cell survival, cell needs oxygen, nutrients like glucose, amino acids, fatty acids, electrolytes like salts, sodium, chloride, and water are essential substrates for the cell survival, and the cell survival depends on the metabolic process that is happening within the cell. So the cell will pick up the oxygen, it will pick up the nutrients from the extracellular fluid. So from the extracellular fluid, the cell will take up the oxygen, the cell will take up the nutrients, and there will be oxidation of nutrients, resulting in formation of carbon dioxide, water, ATP production, and heat generation. So the cell will take up the nutrients and oxygen from the extracellular fluid, and it produces the waste product carbon dioxide along with that metabolic water. So there should be maintenance of near normal values of oxygen, nutrients within the ECF. What happens if the levels of oxygen or the nutrients fall in the ECF? So the cell will be deprived of oxygen and nutrients, and the cell survival will be affected. So how these oxygen levels and nutrient levels are maintained within the normal range within the extracellular fluid? Let's give an example now. So if you go to high altitude where partial pressures of oxygen is less, there is decreased partial pressures of oxygen in high altitude, so that the extracellular fluid oxygen levels will also be reduced. So if there is decreased oxygen levels in the ECF, how much oxygen that will be taken up by the cell uptake of oxygen is also reduced. That will result in hypoxia. So it is very important for the maintenance of oxygen levels within the extracellular fluid. So this is homeostasis of oxygen. So maintenance of nearly constant conditions in the partial pressures of oxygen within the extracellular fluid is also a homeostasis. So similarly, the maintenance of near constant conditions of glucose levels within the extracellular fluid is also homeostasis. Consider now how these values are maintained within the normal conditions whenever there is alteration in oxygen or glucose levels. So whenever there is a decrease in oxygen levels, how it is brought back to normal? So whenever there is a decrease in oxygen level, so this is sensed by a sensor. It can be a chemoreceptor which will send the signals to the center, and the center will send the signals to the effectors. So effectors like respiratory system, lungs for hyperventilation, so that is how increased oxygen levels happens. So this is a feedback cycle. Whenever there is a change in the variable, this is brought back to normal by a feedback cycle. This feedback cycle is a negative feedback cycle. Similarly, we can explain whenever there is decrease in the ECF volume or decrease in blood pressure. So how this is brought back to normal ECF volume or normal blood pressure? How this is brought back? So this is sensed by sensors or receptors, baroreceptors. This will send the signals to the center. The center here can be a brain stem center, and these will send the signals to the effectors. Effectors can be either cardiac muscles of heart, smooth muscles of blood vessels. So either there can be increased pumping of heart or smooth muscle contraction resulting in vasoconstriction, and that is how blood pressure is brought back to normal. So whenever there is a change in the variable or a parameter, how it is brought back to normal? This is again by a feedback cycle. So this is a negative feedback cycle. So why it is called a negative feedback cycle? See, the final response what is happening is correction. Response is nothing but correction, which is in negative to initial stimulus. Initial stimulus. What is initial stimulus? The change in variable. So for example, initial stimulus, if there is a fall in blood pressure, the response or correction is increasing the blood pressure, bringing the blood pressure to normal value. So this is negative feedback mechanism. Similarly, you can explain one more negative feedback mechanism, how ECF pH is regulated. So whenever there is decrease in pH or increase in hydrogen ion concentration, we call it as acidosis. How this is brought back to pH becomes normal, or hydrogen ion concentration brought back to normal, or pH of 7.4 is brought back to normal. So ECF or plasma pH is normally 7.35 to 7.45. You can keep it as 7.4 plus or minus 0.5. So this is a normal pH of plasma. So whenever there is acidosis, for example lactic acidosis or ketoacidosis, there is increase in hydrogen ion concentration. So whenever there is a alteration in the pH, the cell enzymatic activity is also affected and the cell survival is affected. So this change in pH has to be brought back to normal. So what is the mechanism how it is brought back to normal? So whenever there is increase in hydrogen ion concentration, this indirectly will increase the carbon dioxide levels. So how these two are related? So hydrogen ion will combine with the bicarbonate buffers to form carbonic acid, a weak acid, which can dissociate to carbon dioxide and water. So increased hydrogen ion concentration is nothing but increase in the carbon dioxide levels. So whenever there is increase in carbon dioxide levels, this carbon dioxide will stimulate the center. So which center is stimulated? Respiratory center is stimulated. Respiratory center is stimulated. So when the respiratory center in the brain stem is stimulated, this will send the signals to the inspiratory muscles, mainly diaphragm, to increase the force of contraction of inspiratory muscles, resulting in hyperventilation. So what is hyperventilation? Hyperventilation is nothing but increase in the depth of ventilation and also frequency of ventilation or rate. So whenever there is increase in the rate and depth of ventilation, what is happening? The carbon dioxide wash out. Carbon dioxide, more and more carbon dioxide is washed out. More and more carbon dioxide is let out. So whenever more and more carbon dioxide is let out, it is indirectly decreasing the hydrogen ion levels also, decreasing the carbon dioxide level and decreasing the hydrogen ion levels. So bringing back the hydrogen ion levels to normal and pH to normal. So this is one more example for a negative feedback mechanism. So why did you say it is a negative feedback mechanism? The final response is in opposite direction to the initial stimulus. So initial stimulus is increased hydrogen ion concentration or fall in pH. The final change is in opposite to that of the initial response, initial stimulus. So now we can move into certain positive feedback cycles. What is the role of positive feedback cycle in homeostasis? So positive feedback cycle is almost like a vicious cycle. Positive feedback cycle is a vicious cycle where whenever there is a change in variable, this change is exaggerated. This change is exaggerated by a vicious cycle. For example, whenever there is decrease in blood volume. So for example, in case of road traffic accident, there is blood loss and there is a decrease in blood volume. So when there is decrease in blood volume, what happens to the venous return? The amount of blood returning back to the heart is also decreased. So when the venous return is decreased, the amount of blood pumped out by the heart, cardiac output is also decreased. So when the amount of blood pumped out by the heart, cardiac output is decreased, the blood circulation to the cardiac muscles, cardiac blood supply, cardiac muscle blood supply is decreased. So ischemia to the cardiac muscle, cardiac ischemia, this happens. So because of the cardiac ischemia, the cardiac pump, cardiac muscle weakness happens. So whenever there is a muscle weakness, this will result in decreased pumping activity of the heart. So when there is decreased pumping activity of the heart, what is happening? The cardiac output again drops. So when the cardiac output again drops, the amount of blood pumped by the heart is again decreased. When the amount of blood pumped by the heart is decreased, the amount of blood reaching to the cardiac muscle is also decreased. So cardiac muscular ischemia again continues, and this further decreases the cardiac output, decrease the pumping activity of the heart, and resulting in finally cardiac failure. So this is a positive feedback mechanism. This is like a vicious cycle, decreasing the cardiac output, finally ending with the cardiac failure. So this is a positive feedback mechanism with a negative example where this will affect the health of the person or even the death of the person. But in certain conditions, positive feedback mechanisms are beneficial. We'll give an example where the positive feedback mechanisms are having beneficial role. We'll take an example of blood coagulation. So in case of blood coagulation, so this is an artery, and consider there is some injury here, so it starts bleeding. So how to prevent bleeding? The platelets will come and adhere here. The platelets will form a plug blocking the site of damage or injury, and along with these platelets, the coagulation factors have role in formation of clot. So these coagulation factors are initially in inactive form, they get activated. So there are various coagulation factors. Activation of one coagulation factor will keep on activating the subsequent other coagulation factors by a positive feedback mechanism. So overall, all the coagulation factors will get activated, finally formation of clot. So this is an example of positive feedback mechanism where coagulation factor 1 activated will further activate remaining coagulation factors, resulting in activation of all the coagulation factors and clot formation. So blood coagulation is one example of positive feedback mechanism which is having a beneficial effect. One more positive feedback mechanism with beneficial effect is parturition or child labor or birth. So how this is a positive feedback mechanism, let's explain. So consider that this is an uterine cavity. So this is the cervical portion, cervix, and this is the fundus. And consider the head is here, the head portion is here, the baby's head is down. Now what happens when this head tries to descend down? It will stretch the cervix. The cervical stretch will stimulate the stretch receptors in the cervix, and these will send the signals to the hypothalamus and posterior pituitary to release oxytocin. And this oxytocin will act on the muscles of the fundal region, resulting in contraction of this fundus. So this contraction of fundus will further push the baby downwards, and further push of baby downwards will further push the head downwards, and there will be further and further stretch in the cervical region, and this cervical stretch receptors will further get activated, and this will send the signals to the hypothalamus and posterior pituitary to release more and more oxytocin, and this will cause further increased more and more contraction of the fundal region and further descent of the head downwards. So this is how child labor happens, by a positive feedback mechanism. Let's explain one more example for positive feedback mechanism, that is generation of action potential. So generation of action potential by Hodgkin cycles. Hodgkin cycle is an example of positive feedback mechanism where how action potential is generated. So this will describe in detail in subsequent classes, but briefly you can explain like action potential is generated when there is change in the membrane conductance. Initially at resting state, the membrane was more permeable for potassium ions. So when a threshold stimulus is applied, there will be opening up of voltage gated sodium ion channels, and once the sodium ion channels are opened, the entry of positive charge into the cell will result in opening up of more and more sodium channels and more entry of positive charge, resulting in rapid depolarization. So generation of action potential by a positive feedback mechanism where entry of positive charge sodium ions through the voltage gated sodium channels will open up more and more voltage gated sodium channels and taking the membrane potential from the firing level towards plus 30 millivolt in case of neurons. So this is because of the vicious cycle, and you call it as Hodgkin's cycle. This is an example of positive feedback mechanism. So to summarize, homeostasis is maintenance of nearly constant conditions in the internal environment. So what is this internal environment? Internal environment is nothing but the interstitial fluid portion of extracellular fluid. See, these cells are surrounded by some fluid. So this cell surrounded by fluid, this portion is ISF, interstitial fluid portion. So in this interstitial fluid portion, the parameters like oxygen has to be maintained within the normal, glucose has to be maintained within the normal, carbon dioxide has to be maintained within the normal. Oxygen, glucose, carbon dioxide has to be maintained within the normal. Interstitial fluid volume has to be maintained within the normal. Interstitial fluid temperature has to be maintained within the normal. Interstitial fluid pH has to be maintained within the normal. Interstitial fluid electrolytes has to be maintained within the normal values, because the cell for its survival need all these oxygen, glucose, and optimal temperature and pH, and also optimal levels of electrolytes and metabolic waste products that has to be eliminated from the interstitial fluid. So maintenance of near normal values of all these parameters within the internal environment is homeostasis. All the organ systems have role in maintenance of homeostasis. Now what is the role of respiratory system in maintenance of homeostasis? Respiratory system, the airways and lungs will pick up the oxygen and it adds oxygen to the extracellular fluid, and it removes the carbon dioxide from the extracellular fluid. So this is how the oxygen levels and the carbon dioxide levels within the extracellular fluid is maintained by the respiratory system. Next, what is the role of cardiovascular system? So cardiovascular system is a vehicle for the transport of gases and also nutrients. So cardiovascular system, the heart will pump the blood through the blood vessels, and the oxygen and nutrients will be reaching the extracellular or interstitial fluid portion by the pumping action of the heart, and these acts as a vehicle for oxygen and nutrients. The third is renal system. What is the role of renal system in maintenance of homeostasis? Renal system will excrete hydrogen ions or acids are excreted in urine. The urine pH is acidic. The renal system will excrete the H plus ions or acids so that pH of the extracellular fluid is regulated, and also the renal system will excrete the metabolic waste products which are non-volatile acids. Metabolic waste products are excreted, and renal system also has role in maintenance of ECF volume. How it maintains the ECF volume is by renin-angiotensin aldosterone system. ECF volume is maintained, and the role of ADH over the distal convoluted tubule, ECF volume is maintained. So even the renal system is having the role in homeostasis. Respiratory system, cardiovascular system, renal system. Then what is the role of gastrointestinal tract or GI system in maintenance of homeostasis? Gastrointestinal system will cause ingestion of the nutrients, digestion of the nutrients, and absorption of the nutrients. That is how the nutrients are added to the extracellular fluid. It will provide nutrients and maintain the nutrients level within the ECF. Now, what is the role of central nervous system and endocrine system, endocrine system in maintenance of homeostasis? These central nervous system and endocrine nervous system, they are the regulating systems. They are the regulating systems. They will control the different systems in the body in regulation of various parameters. Central nervous system will have so many centers within the central nervous system, like respiratory center is present in the central nervous system, that will control the respiratory system in supplying of oxygen and removal of carbon dioxide. Central nervous system will have the temperature regulating centers within its hypothalamus for regulation of temperature, and central nervous system is having the centers for food intake, appetite center and satiety centers that will regulate the nutrient levels within the ECF. So that is how central nervous system has role in regulating the other systems, and the various parameters of the ECF is maintained. The endocrine system, by release of endocrines, hormones, these hormones will act on the cells for its cell growth, development, and for the cell metabolic activities. So that is how endocrine system will complement the central nervous system in regulating and maintenance of homeostasis. So by now it's very clear that homeostasis is nothing but maintenance of near normal values of all these variables in the extracellular fluid for the cell survival, for the cell growth and cell division. And all the organ systems have role in homeostasis, and these variables, whenever there is change in these variables are brought back to normal by regulatory mechanisms or feedback cycles. The major regulatory mechanism is negative feedback mechanism, and I have already explained you the examples for negative feedback mechanisms. Thank you.